Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Julian Weinrib. I am the Director of the Office of the Vice Provost, Innovations in Undergraduate Education. Our office has coordinated this series of webinar sessions, and we're very appreciative of the time that you're all making available to attend today. And we're certainly appreciative of the time that our panelists have put together to help our community work through some of the challenges being experienced with regards to the COVID pandemic. So as you'll see on the slide available, this is the second of 8 sessions, and certainly if there are more sessions that are of interest to you, there'll be resources provided at the end of the session as to how you might register for those other sessions. But I'd like to give as much time as possible to our panelists today. So I'd just like to introduce for the topic of community engaged learning and thinking through remote course design or considering alternatives to what has traditionally been offered as in-person placements and practicums and experiences. We have a panel together that are going to work through some different ideas and opportunities. We have Jennifer Esmail, the Assistant Director of Experiential Learning and the Center for Community Partnerships, as well as Professor Michelle Arnott from the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology in the Faculty of Medicine, and Heather Hermont, who is the Lead Coordinator of Academic Initiatives at the Center for Community Partnerships. I'd like to thank them all for their work today, and I hope that today is a helpful and beneficial session to you all, and certainly feel free to follow up with questions afterwards based on whatever it is that you take away and have more interested in. So thank you very much, and with that I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you and your loved ones are well during these challenging times in the pandemic. As Julian said, I'm Jennifer Esmail. I'm Assistant Director of Experiential Learning in the Center for Community Partnerships, and the 2 session speakers Julian already introduced. I want to introduce you to the Center for Community Partnerships. Looking at the participant list, looks like a lot of you have engaged with us before, but for those of you who don't know about us, we're a U of T office that provides support to faculty, students, community partners, and staff across all 3 campuses for community engaged learning and research initiatives. For faculty, we convene workshops and events to bring instructors together to learn from each other and develop their pedagogy and practice. We can consult on your community engaged learning course development and support you with your partnerships and placements. And I just want to emphasize that if you are thinking of offering a community engaged learning course, even if you're just in the preliminary stages, please reach out to us after the webinar. We'd be very happy to support you with that. So today's session is focused on a form of experiential learning known as community engaged learning. And for us at the CCP, we say that community engaged learning meets these 4 criteria. 1 is it's enabled through partnerships, always, through communities or, with communities or with grassroots nonprofit or public organizations. 2, it's responsive to community defined priorities. 3, it's rooted in reciprocity. So it's really important that both community partners and students benefit from the engagement. And finally, it asks students to undertake reflection or some way of connecting their community engagement to the defined learning objectives of the course. These are our goals for the webinar today. 1 is we want to provide you with an overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the nonprofit sector, as well as what the implications are for community engaged learning. 2nd, we want to outline 3 key models of remote CEL that might work for you, as well as some alternative strategies for teaching community engagement. And 3, we're going to share the experience of an instructor, that's Michelle Arnott, as she transforms her CEL course into one that can be delivered remotely. So I'm going to hand it over to Heather Hermont from the Center for Community Partnerships.
Good morning, everybody. So nice to have you all here. And thank you, Jennifer and Julian. Yes, I'm going to address first the COVID-19 pandemic's impacts on our community partners before moving on to speak about how we might think about doing CEL remotely. So the pandemic has, as you might have anticipated or already know very well, has had very profound impacts on the nonprofit sector in the GTA. And there are three main areas of stress. The first is massive losses in revenue. The second is staffing and volunteer challenges. And the third is programming and service cancellations and office closures. So for many organizations, these serious challenges are taking place as demand for services and programming is actually growing as a consequence of the pandemic. So at the very same time that organizational capacity is strained, there may be emerging and deepening needs in the communities that our community organizations are working with. So naturally, this is going to have some implications for community engaged learning. And I'd like to talk about three areas for consideration. The first is reprioritization of organizational activities. So many organizations are being forced to triage their activities to address urgent community needs, principally around poverty, food security, and health. So where organizations might have had a range of activities before, they may have shifted quite dramatically, for instance, to food provision. Second, so in that reprioritization, where organizations might have held as a high priority educating our students, that will most often move down the list of priorities in the current situation. Also, in the past, organizations have been able to integrate students into existing volunteer programs and volunteer infrastructure. But in the current crisis, a lot of volunteer programs have halted. So we've lost that, let's say, point of insertion. And finally, the planning horizons have changed quite dramatically. So where typically we might have had many months lead time to secure placements, organizations know round about now what's going to be happening in September. At present, a lot of community organizations cannot commit to placements that are months away. There's also the issue of reduced staff capacity to coordinate and supervise students. So as I mentioned before, one of the impacts has been staff layoffs, and then those who are working from home are working, as we all have learned, with additional burdens. And all this at the same time is increased demand for services and programs. So there's limited benefit for lots of organizations to be developing project and placement ideas, managing communications between faculty and the organization, thinking about supervising students. So this has major implications for doing CEL remotely. Finally, I wanted to draw attention to the question of power and resource imbalances. In CEL, we always talk about how to share power and resources equitably in our community partnerships. And it may be that in the current situation, pre-existing imbalances are heightened and problematic at present. This is between the university and nonprofit organizations, generally speaking, but also within the sector, the nonprofit sector. Many organizations have had to shut down, some of them permanently. So this might seem like a grim picture, but despite these challenges, there are still models of remote CEL delivery that may work very well for faculty, for students, and for community partners. Anything that I say about models will be found in our Community Engaged Learning and Online Spaces Guide for instructors. This was probably sent out to you with your reminder of today's event. It's linked to in the slides, which will be available after the session. And it's also on the Remote EL SharePoint site. So we are talking about three models of remote CEL delivery. The first is the consultation model. So this is when community partners identify and introduce challenges, and then students work in teams remotely to devise solutions or response to those challenges. So for example, a community partner wants to communicate the benefits of harm reduction to the general public, and students work in teams to create a communication strategy. The second model is the project model, where students contribute to initiatives led by partners, but without necessarily working towards a predetermined outcome. So for instance, a partner wishes to create multilingual brochures that address COVID-19 and physical distancing. So students might do an environmental scan, research best practices, and then make recommendations on content and design. And then finally, we talk about the one-on-one model. So this is where each student is paired with one individual from or through the partner organization. So for instance, a student might have a social visit online with a senior, a weekly, or might tutor a high school student, or might meet regularly with a social sector mentor. I just wanted to mention this briefly for those who might find that they want to teach community engagement in some capacity in the absence of actual placements, that this outlines some ideas for matching learning objectives to some strategies. To give just one example, so if you wanted to engage your students in social justice work, you might devise an in-class project such as podcast series, an advocacy campaign, or having your students research community resilience and COVID-19. But in terms of remote CEL delivery, working with community partners, I just want to outline a few recommended strategies and considerations before passing it off to Michelle to talk about her course. We've had many questions, and we've asked these questions of ourselves as well, how to do community partner relationship building in this kind of circumstance that we find ourselves in. And what we're hearing and what we are recommending is to go back to and maintain your warm relationships that you've had. We're hearing from longstanding partners that it does mean a lot to hear from us that we're here and that we want to support, but that we be ready to pause if needed, if that's what the situation is asking for. So to go back to those warm relationships, but also to look for new partners. And while we would typically say, and we always practice with CEL, that the ideas for where students are placed begins with the community partners, identifying projects, initiatives, and so on. It might be that in this circumstance, it would be helpful to offer more concrete proposals yourself and to identify what sorts of flexibilities you and your students have. To do some of that legwork that a community partner might usually do but doesn't have the capacity for right now. As always, clear communication about expectations is vital. In terms of course design and management, the name of the game is real flexibility and adaptability. And that is in terms of the activities that your students might do in their placements, the structure of the engagement, hours, both scheduling and number of hours, and of course the planning, as I noted before, with this changing planning horizons. Partners' timelines might be really urgent, so it's worth thinking about as instructors whether you and your students can adapt and respond to urgent timelines. And also partners' needs may shift suddenly. So we are certainly learning this in our co-curricular programming this summer, that what might seem like is going to happen might change at the beginning of an engagement, might change quite dramatically within a couple of weeks. It's also important to expect to take on more supervision than you typically would in a CEL course. Again, as a result of this capacity strain in organizations. And that implies an added workload for instructors, but there are strategies that you can take in designing your course that can mitigate some of it. One example might be integrating peer evaluation and feedback activities in the arc of the course. As always, you're going to want to consider what special training students may need before they begin their placements, and to make sure to integrate that into the curriculum. And then finally, whether you're doing remote CEL delivery or designing assignments that might integrate community engaged issues into teaching, design projects with being informed by the communities you're asking your students to engage, and foreground for your students and use yourself anti-oppressive and assets-based approaches. So I'm going to end there and hand it off to Michelle, who has extensive experience doing community engaged learning, and her redesign of her course responds to illustrates all of what I've been talking about. So on to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Heather, Jennifer, and Julian. So I'm going to be talking about the plans that have taken place over the last couple weeks with respect to adjusting my course, PCL 389, for remote delivery. This is just kind of an overview of what I will be talking about. I'll just go through briefly so some of you are aware of the course, some learning objectives and goals for the course. I'll talk a little bit about our partners. And then I'll talk about the big question that I had and I've had very recently over and over again, but should I offer this course this year? And then what do students get out of it and kind of my thinking behind that. I'll talk a little bit about approaching partners, how to leverage projects that are meaningful for students. I know this was a question from a number of individuals who registered, and we'll just talk a little bit of how I'm trying to do that and still maintain the intimacy and empathy that's associated with community engaged learning. And hopefully we can have some discussion at the end regarding some of this. I know another big point was brought up in the questions that you guys proposed was how do we maintain student engagement? So I know there's another webinar that's going to be focusing on this, but there's lots of different ways within Blackboard or Zoom or Teams that you can integrate different types of student engagement. If we get a chance today, we'll be looking at breakout rooms, but you're more than willing to contact me and we can talk about some of these. And then obviously, anytime we talk about teaching, we obviously have to think about assessment. And so I know there's been a lot of discussion on assessment that's going to happen remotely this year. And there's been a lot of conversations in my units. And I'll just talk a little bit about how that has and hasn't changed for this course for me. So my course is called The Role of Pharmacology and Toxicology in Society. I've been running it for, I think, 13-ish years. And we partner with community health organization, outreach groups, harm reduction groups across the Greater Toronto area. So it could be anywhere from Etobicoke to Scarborough. The course, it's a pharmacology and toxicology course. We're a department that is within the Faculty of Medicine, and we teach undergraduate arts and science students. And it really focuses on drug use, substance use disorder, and mental health, often within marginalized communities. And we're going to come back to this in a minute. So our course learning objectives is obviously to improve student knowledge. Every course that we teach at the university is to improve student knowledge. And more specifically about knowledge in the community. So a lot of people think of pharmacology or whatever their discipline is a very distilled manner of I need to learn this because they're going to test me on it at the end of the semester. But I really try to show them how their knowledge is actually applicable within multiple communities outside of the university or outside of what they're being asked to do for a course. Then I try to link students' awareness between what happens in the class to what's happening in the community. Obviously, engage students in community and social awareness. We take a very kind of pillars of health look at substance use disorder and the communities in which we're working with. And then it's obviously to improve students' awareness in pharmacology and toxicology. The learning outcomes are pretty straightforward, articulate a number of core concepts that come out of the course, evaluate strengths and weaknesses and challenges of health and social policies. These have not changed, and the course goals haven't changed either. When I started to sit down and to look at how I was going to operate the course, though, one of the learning outcomes I did notice needed to be adjusted for this year because of COVID and the adjustments to remote or high flex. We obviously weren't going to have students integrated into a community learning experience or into a community physically. And so I adjusted this learning outcome so that students have the opportunity to integrate their own experiences and knowledge, expand their perspectives through sharing and listening to community voices with lived experiences. And it's linked or similar to the above learning outcome, but it is subtly different in that it doesn't require the physical placement of a student within a community partner and rather relies more on expanding their perspective through a number of different ways, as well as providing them an opportunity to connect with lived experiences from peer mentors. So why offer PCL 389 this year? I've had a lot of thoughts about this because it's not what I originally intended with respect to the course, or it's not how obviously I envisioned this course 13 years ago. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to the fact that, particularly with the community partners and the issues that we deal with, they're not going away because of COVID. If anything, they're more relevant today. Substance use disorder and the drug using community is marginalized and even probably more negatively affected by COVID. And as we've heard in the news, overdose deaths across Canada are not going down, they're going up. As well, it gives an opportunity for our partners to access knowledge and have access to maybe not volunteers in the traditional sense that they're used to, but students who can work on something that might be useful to the partner. And then the final one comes down to the students, is students are really provided an incredible learning experience with community engaged learning. And these are two quotes from reflections from a paper my teaching colleague who's here in attendance, Nufisa, and I published a few years back. And these are just reflect some of what our students get out of community engaged learning. And I don't expect or hypothesize that this will be any different this year. I think if we give them an opportunity to connect with different aspects of the topic and connect with different people and work as a team and struggle with some of the difficult kind of questions that are associated with substance use disorder, that I still expect that some of these, if not all of these, ideas will be met or goals will be met. So how did I approach partners for COVID planning? Well, first of all, as Heather already alluded to, I try to appreciate the very, very challenging space that they're finding themselves in currently. Some of them are just back to work now. Some of them have been working probably overtime since this started. And I wanted to really be open to different opportunities or different ways in which we could actually collaborate, and maybe not in the traditional sense. So I really wanted to be flexible in my planning, as Heather also alluded to. And so I came up with a number of different plans, and I call them Plan A, B, all the way to Z, because there are a couple difference in here. But obviously Plan A would be what would be most ideal from my perspective, not necessarily from the partner's perspective, but is organizations take on a remote project and they supervise students. This would be something that maybe it was in one of the models Heather mentioned, but maybe they have something that they need done and they have the time and the ability to supervise a team of students on a particular project. The other idea that we came up with was kind of this consultation model. Is we do know, I've been doing this now for 13 years, so I do know what some of the repetitive needs of the community are. They're always interested in as they should be, particular topics within pharmacology, and that might be drug-drug interactions, or it might be how does cannabis affect prescription medications. It might be, for this year, it might be how what are some of the drugs used to treat COVID, and does that have a role with moving forward? So the idea with this one is that we would create these projects, and then really partners could subscribe to access the information that was developed by the students and use it however they feel would be beneficial to their group. Plan Z, so if these two don't work, is we've had an idea of case studies, so using case studies, examination of drug use in the media and culture over time. So to really try to get on how language has changed and how language alters individuals' perspective. And this is kind of an interesting take, or an interesting way to provide students an opportunity to see how a community can become marginalized, and how, hopefully, how perspective can change with experience, etc. And then the other thing that we did with respect to approaching the partners is we provided an opportunity for them to join the course. So I have a letter, my first email that went out to everybody, and a form that was developed with Rebecca Wolf at the Center for Community Partnership. And we asked them if they wanted to come to class. So as a guest, as a visitor, they would come, share their experiences, share their perspective, etc. Students could ask questions. And this is really kind of where I'm hoping some of that empathy and intimacy will develop within the class itself. So later on during the webinar or during the Q&A session, I'll share with you a file that you can use for your own reference with respect to a form, a collaboration form, and the first contact email to help anybody who's unsure on how to go about that. Another question that was really came up quite a few times with registration was, how do we make meaningful connections? And it's not just meaningful connections with our partners, but it's also with our peers, with faculty that are teaching, with the projects themselves. And I'm going to talk about a couple ways in which I'm doing it, but I did make the decision to go entirely online. I had initially thought this would be a high flex course where you would have a certain portion of students in the classroom and a certain portion of students watching online. But at the end of the day, I was given a room in which I was only 12 students, 12 out of approximately 36 to 40 students could attend in person. And Nufisa and I discussed at great length what we should do. And really, a question of equity came up. These classes, for any of you that have taught them before, are very intimate. Students share a lot, and I wanted the discussion to be full, and I felt that by having both in person and online would not necessarily be as equitable with this type of course, in that students that were in person might be having, or might be perceived as having, an advantage. And I didn't want that to happen. Obviously, the whole course is based on understanding equity, and marginalized communities, and I didn't want to create that with two populations of students in the course. So it will be online. The course will not be recorded. That's another decision that I came to, because the discussions are so sometimes intimate and personal that we're having with the students. So it will only be offered synchronously. I'll be having a confidentiality statement that we've used every year, but we'll really talk about this in the first class, and it'll be very aware to students who are registering. And this means that some students that want the course may not take it this year. Hopefully they'll be able to take it next year. But that's just something that, a decision that we had to make to try to maintain some equity and allow for that intimacy and the fullness of conversation to happen. As I said, part of connecting to the content is about discussing with people who have lived experience. And so we have invited community partners and peer workers to attend lecture. I'm very happy to say that we've gotten some positive responses back already, which is great. So we will be having a couple of visitors from our community partners, longstanding community partners, and even a new community partner this year. So I'm very excited about that. It's an opportunity for students to connect and ask questions, and just try to improve or increase their understanding and perspective of the situation. We also have experts from obviously the research field. We're in the Faculty of Medicine, and so there's a lot of our colleagues that are doing research in substance use, and we will be accessing them as well. And then experts from the healthcare field. We have a physician at CAMH that comes regularly, and this year, hopefully we'll have somebody who might be able to talk about how to be an ally, which I think is really important just with respect to a lot of what's going on these days. Well, yeah. So also the importance of projects and bringing it back to what students are learning. So this is something that I did in person. but it's also something that I'm really going to kind of elevate this year, is the application of why students are working on a particular project and the relevance of it to this particular community. So we've always had class discussions, and as I said, I'll try to elevate that. I also embed their experiences with their projects or their partners in student reflective prompts, to have students maybe take a step back and look about what is the relevance of what they're doing and how might this affect others. And then we're also going to be doing a lot of group activities. So on that note, we thought we'd have a little bit of fun with you to show how you could get a little bit of an intimate scene with a class of 30 or 40 students. And so we have this reflection question here. If creating meaningful connections, either to the partner, to the theory, to your peers, to the knowledge, is key for a community engaged learning course, how can you continue to enable those connections in a course taught remotely? So we're just going to send you now to some breakout rooms for you to discuss this question. So how might you, and you can talk with your peers in the breakout room, enable those connections in a course that you're teaching or in other courses, etc. And we'll give you about 4 to 5 minutes, and then I'll bring you back and we will go from there with respect to just finishing things up and talking a little bit about assessment before we go to the question and answer. So we'll give you about 4 minutes. So we'll see you in the breakout rooms.